1. Hamas attack on October 7, 2023. On October 7, 2023, Hamas militants launched a large-scale, coordinated attack on southern Israel from Gaza, using rocket fire and breaches in Israel's border barriers. This assault targeted both military installations and civilian populations, causing widespread destruction and loss of life. In response, Israel initiated heavy airstrikes and a ground invasion in Gaza, significantly intensifying the conflict. The violence quickly spread beyond Gaza, affecting the West Bank and raising tensions at the Lebanese border, thereby drawing global attention to the escalating situation. 2. Global attention on Israel-Hamas conflict. The October 7 attack by Hamas and the subsequent Israeli retaliation have captured global attention, as the conflict in the region reached new levels of intensity. The international community has become increasingly concerned about the potential for further escalation, particularly with the involvement of other regional actors like Hezbollah from Lebanon. The violence has not only led to a humanitarian crisis in Gaza but also heightened fears of a broader Middle Eastern war, as diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation struggle to gain traction. 3. Hamas's history and objectives. Hamas, an Islamist political and militant organization, was established in 1987 during the First Intifada with the aim of creating an Islamic state in historic Palestine, encompassing modern-day Israel. Over the years, Hamas has positioned itself as a central player in the Palestinian resistance against Israeli occupation, gaining significant political power after winning the 2006 Palestinian elections. Following the 2007 Battle of Gaza, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip, further intensifying its conflict with Israel. Despite being labeled a terrorist organization by most Western nations, Hamas's strategy of armed resistance continues to garner substantial support among Palestinians, who view the group as a defender against Israeli occupation and settlement expansions. 4. Palestinian support for armed resistance. Amidst ongoing Israeli occupation and perceived failures of diplomatic solutions, support for armed resistance among Palestinians has surged. A 2023 poll by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research indicated that 72% of Palestinians in the West Bank endorse militant groups like the Lion's Den and Jenin Brigade, which have gained popularity for their hardline stance against Israeli occupation. This growing sentiment is fueled by Israel's increasingly aggressive policies, including settlement expansions, military actions, and the erosion of prospects for a two-state solution, all of which have exacerbated Palestinian grievances and driven many toward endorsing violent resistance. 5. Escalating violence in 2023. Throughout 2023, violence between Israelis and Palestinians escalated sharply, with a significant increase in settler violence, administrative detentions, and Palestinian casualties. This year has been marked by frequent clashes in the West Bank, including high-profile incidents of violence by Israeli settlers against Palestinian communities. The ongoing military actions by Israel, perceived as dismissive of peace negotiations and the two-state solution, have further fueled the conflict. As tensions reached a boiling point, Hamas bolstered its military capabilities, ignoring warnings from international actors like the United States and Egypt, setting the stage for the October 7 escalation. 1. Israeli intelligence underestimates Hamas. Israeli intelligence, including the renowned Mossad, severely underestimated the capabilities and intentions of Hamas in the lead-up to the October 7, 2023 attack. Despite receiving detailed intelligence reports that outlined potential plans for a large-scale assault involving drones and paragliders, Israeli leadership dismissed these warnings as exaggerated, believing Hamas lacked the resources and sophistication to carry out such an operation. This misjudgment was further compounded by the Israeli Signals Intelligence Unit, which raised alarms about Hamas's preparations, only for these concerns to be ignored. The prevailing belief within Israeli intelligence circles was that Hamas had been effectively contained and was seeking to avoid a full-scale war. This complacency proved disastrous when, on the morning of October 7, Hamas launched their meticulously planned and coordinated operation, code-named Al-Aqsa Flood, catching Israeli forces off guard. 2. Hamas's coordinated assault on Israel. At precisely 6:30 a.m. on October 7, 2023, Hamas initiated Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, launching a multi-pronged attack on Israel that caught the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, by surprise. The offensive began with a massive and well-coordinated rocket barrage targeting critical Israeli military and civilian infrastructure. While the rockets rained down, over 3,000 Hamas militants infiltrated Israel by breaching the border barrier. This unprecedented assault involved the use of aerial drones to scout and disable Israeli observation posts, allowing fighters to bypass traditional security measures. In a display of advanced tactical coordination, Hamas militants utilized paragliders, speedboats, and motor vehicles to penetrate deep into Israeli territory, overwhelming the initial defenses. The breach of border checkpoints and fences facilitated the entry of larger vehicles, enabling Hamas forces to rapidly gain ground and establish footholds within Israel. 3. Amphibious landing and capture of Israeli military sites. Following the successful breaches of border defenses, Hamas militants expanded their offensive with an amphibious landing at Sikkim, a coastal area in southern Israel. This landing resulted in the brutal murder of 10 civilians on the beach and another 9 in a nearby shelter, underscoring the ruthlessness of the attack. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, responded swiftly, managing to kill 2 of the attackers on the beach and destroy 4 of their vessels, including 2 rubber boats. However, the Hamas assault continued unabated, with militants capturing a nearby military base near Nahal Oz. The capture of this base led to the deaths of at least 2 Israeli soldiers and the capture of 6 others, showcasing the tactical success of Hamas in targeting Israeli military infrastructure. Intense fighting also erupted at the Re'im military base, where Hamas temporarily seized control and took several Israeli soldiers captive before the IDF regained control. Additionally, Hamas militants captured the police station in Sderot, killing 30 Israelis, including police officers and civilians, further highlighting the scale and ferocity of the attack. 4. Hamas's tactics and Israeli military response. In the midst of the escalating assault, the Israeli military response was initially slow and disorganized. Helicopters dispatched from the north faced significant challenges in distinguishing Hamas militants from civilians, as the militants employed tactics designed to blend in with the local population. These tactics included avoiding sudden movements and running, which are typically associated with civilian behavior during air raids, making it difficult for Israeli forces to identify and target the attackers. As a result, Israeli pilots initially bombarded targets indiscriminately, striking around 300 sites within just 4 hours. However, as the situation unfolded, target selection became more cautious to minimize civilian casualties. The confusion and chaos were further exacerbated by the militants' ability to seamlessly integrate into the civilian environment, effectively using the fog of war to their advantage. By 9 a.m., the situation had deteriorated to the point where some Israeli helicopters engaged targets without prior clearance, reflecting the growing disarray within the IDF's ranks. In a televised appearance, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israel was officially at war, signaling the beginning of a prolonged and intense conflict. Fact 1. Israeli response and Operation Swords of Iron. In the wake of Hamas's devastating attack on October 7, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israel would respond with overwhelming force, vowing to turn every location where Hamas was organized or hiding into cities of ruins. This declaration set the stage for the IDF's Operation Swords of Iron, a large-scale military response aimed at dismantling Hamas's operational capabilities. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, rapidly mobilized, with extensive military deployments and the declaration of a state of emergency that severely restricted civilian movement, particularly in areas close to the Gaza Strip. As part of this operation, Israel implemented a total blockade of Gaza, cutting off electricity, fuel, and essential supplies. This move drew widespread condemnation from human rights organizations, which criticized the blockade as a form of collective punishment against the Palestinian population. Further controversy erupted when reports emerged from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, accusing Israel of using white phosphorus munitions in its strikes, a claim vehemently denied by Israeli authorities. Despite the denial, these allegations fueled global criticism of Israel's tactics in Gaza. By October 13, the IDF issued a stark warning to the residents of northern Gaza, urging them to evacuate to the south within 24 hours as Israeli forces prepared to escalate their operations. This demand placed Palestinians in an agonizing dilemma: remain in their homes and risk becoming collateral damage, or embark on a perilous journey southward. Hamas, in defiance of the IDF's Warnings urged Palestinians to stay in their homes, accusing Israel of attempting to forcibly displace them. Amid the escalating conflict, Israel faced a barrage of international criticism for its military tactics, especially after making a controversial claim that Hamas was using civilians as human shields. In response, some media outlets countered by alleging that Israeli forces had struck civilians traveling along designated safe routes to southern Gaza. Israel disputed these claims, maintaining that it was targeting only Hamas militants and infrastructure. 2. The urgency and tragedy of evacuations in Gaza. As the Israeli offensive intensified, the situation in Gaza grew increasingly dire. On October 13, the IDF issued a chilling ultimatum to the residents of northern Gaza: evacuate to the south within 24 hours or face the full brunt of the Israeli military's next phase of operations. This warning sparked a mass exodus, with tens of thousands of Palestinians fleeing their homes in search of safety. However, the journey south was fraught with danger. Hamas, which continued to resist the IDF's advances, urged the population to stay put, accusing Israel of attempting to forcibly displace Palestinians as part of a broader strategy to reshape the demographic landscape of Gaza. Despite these warnings, many chose to flee, hoping to avoid the escalating violence. Tragically, the evacuation itself became a perilous endeavor. Reports surfaced of Israeli strikes along supposed safe routes, with civilians caught in the crossfire. On October 17, a particularly devastating airstrike in southern Gaza resulted in the deaths of over 70 civilians, many of whom had fled from the north. Among the dead was Aman Nawal, a senior figure in Hamas's military wing, whose presence in the area likely contributed to the intensity of the IDF's strikes. While Israel hailed the killing of Nawal as a significant military victory, the heavy civilian casualties fueled further outrage and condemnation, particularly as families who had fled from northern Gaza in search of safety found themselves in the line of fire. 3. Clashes with Hamas and international outcry. As the conflict between Israel and Hamas escalated, the fighting grew increasingly intense, particularly in southern Gaza. On October 31, the IDF launched a series of airstrikes against the Jabalia refugee camp, densely populated area that had become a focal point of resistance. The strikes were part of Israel's broader strategy to dismantle Hamas's military infrastructure, but the operation resulted in catastrophic civilian casualties. Eyewitnesses described scenes of utter devastation, with entire families buried under the rubble of their homes. The strikes on Jabalia, which led to the deaths of dozens of women and children, sparked an international outcry, with human rights organizations and foreign governments condemning the IDF's tactics. The strikes were seen as part of a broader pattern of indiscriminate attacks that had characterized Israel's military campaign in Gaza. In response to the growing criticism, Israel defended its actions by pointing to the presence of Hamas militants within civilian areas, accusing the group of using the population as human shields. This claim was met with skepticism by many in the international community, who argued that the scale of the destruction and the number of civilian casualties far outweighed any military gains. The IDF's extensive use of air power, particularly in densely populated areas like Jabalia, raised serious questions about the proportionality of Israel's response and the legality of its actions under international law. Meanwhile, the ongoing violence continued to fuel resistance from Palestinian militants, with groups like the Al-Qassam Brigades and the Democratic Front's National Resistance Brigades launching counterattacks against IDF forces. These groups employed anti-tank missiles and heavy artillery, inflicting casualties on Israeli soldiers and reinforcing their resolve to resist the IDF's advance. 1. Diplomatic fallout and evacuations from Gaza. As the conflict in Gaza intensified, international relations became increasingly strained, with several countries choosing to sever diplomatic ties with Israel in response to its military actions. This diplomatic fallout was mirrored by efforts to evacuate foreign nationals and critically wounded individuals from Gaza. On November 1, the first group of evacuees began leaving Gaza through the Rafah border crossing into Egypt. This group included 500 individuals, with 200 already at the border, primarily comprising foreign nationals and those severely injured in the ongoing conflict. The evacuation process, however, was marred by further violence. On the same day, the Jabalia refugee camp, which had already suffered a devastating bombing, endured another brutal airstrike, leading to renewed international condemnation. The United Nations Human Rights Office expressed grave concerns about the potential war crime implications of such attacks, calling for accountability and an immediate cessation of hostilities. 2 days later, on November 3, an airstrike targeted an ambulance convoy, killing 15 and injuring 60. The IDF justified the strike by claiming that the ambulances were being used by Hamas fighters, a claim strongly denied by both the Palestinian Red Crescent Society and Hamas officials. The incident further inflamed tensions, as it followed strikes on a civilian school and a hospital on November 4, which resulted in additional civilian casualties. In response to these actions, Turkey condemned Israel's refusal to accept a ceasefire and recalled its ambassador, signaling a significant diplomatic rift. Meanwhile, Palestinian militants continue to engage Israeli forces in intense urban battles, reportedly destroying 24 Israeli vehicles in the process. The ongoing strikes, particularly those targeting hospitals, led Human Rights Watch to call for a global weapons embargo on both Israel and Hamas. Despite these calls, the United States pledged an additional $320 million in military aid to Israel, including precision-guided bombs, further complicating the international response to the conflict. 2. Strikes on hospitals and schools amidst urban combat. The conflict in Gaza reached new levels of intensity as Israeli forces expanded their operations to target what they claimed were Hamas strongholds embedded within civilian infrastructure. On November 4, Israeli airstrikes targeted a civilian school and a hospital, leading to significant civilian casualties. These strikes prompted immediate international outrage, with Turkey condemning Israel's actions and recalling its ambassador, signaling a sharp deterioration in diplomatic relations. The Human Rights Watch also weighed in, condemning the strikes and calling for a weapons embargo on both Israel and Hamas, a proposal that was largely ignored by the international community. The situation on the ground in Gaza became increasingly dire, as urban combat between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants intensified. Palestinian fighters, including those from Hamas and other militant groups, engaged in fierce resistance, destroying 24 Israeli vehicles in the urban battlefields of Gaza. The IDF, in response, continued its extensive air and ground operations, aiming to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities, even as civilian areas bore the brunt of the violence. The ongoing conflict drew further scrutiny as reports emerged of another catastrophic bombing at the Jabalia refugee camp on November 3, raising questions about the proportionality and legality of Israel's military actions. The United Nations and various human rights organizations voiced concerns about the potential war crimes implications of these strikes, emphasizing the need for accountability and the protection of civilians. Despite these concerns, the conflict showed no signs of abating, with both sides continuing to engage in heavy fighting, resulting in a growing number of casualties on both sides. 3. Tunnels, hostages, and contested findings. As the conflict progressed, the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, intensified their efforts to dismantle Hamas's military infrastructure, particularly its extensive network of underground tunnels and hidden headquarters. On November 13, the IDF launched a series of raids aimed at clearing out these tunnels, which were suspected to be critical to Hamas's operations. In one such operation beneath the Al-Rantisi hospital in Gaza City, the IDF claimed to have discovered a Hamas holding area for Israeli hostages. They also reported finding a calendar titled Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, which they linked to the October 7 massacre. However, the interpretation of these findings was contentious, with many questioning the evidence and the conclusions drawn by the IDF. The raid on the Al-Rantisi hospital was particularly controversial, as it was accompanied by reports of civilian casualties. The IDF justified their presence at the hospital by citing the need for humanitarian assistance and the search for hostages, but conflicting reports emerged about the true nature of the operation. The Washington Post later conducted an investigation which found no evidence of a Hamas command center at the hospital, further fueling the debate over the IDF's actions. Meanwhile, the situation in Gaza continued to deteriorate, with the IDF imposing further evacuation notices in southern Gaza and implementing a fuel-induced telecommunications blackout, cutting off much of the region from the outside world. This escalation of measures led to growing concerns among international observers about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, as well as the potential long-term consequences of the conflict. 1. Assaults on Indonesia hospital and ceasefire collapse. The assault on the Indonesia hospital in Gaza drew intense international condemnation, particularly due to the presence of a significant number of civilians and medical staff inside the facility during the attack. The hospital, located in northern Gaza, became a symbol of the broader humanitarian crisis as the conflict raged on. Throughout November, the situation in Gaza grew increasingly dire, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Amid mounting international pressure, a ceasefire agreement was reached on November 22 between Israel and Hamas. This ceasefire, facilitated by Egypt and Qatar, included the release of hostages and a temporary halt in hostilities, sparking hopes for a broader peace agreement. Unfortunately, the fragile truce collapsed on December 1, with Israel and the United States blaming Hamas for the breakdown. In response, Israel resumed hostilities, launching airstrikes, particularly in the southern city of Khan Yunis, and enforcing evacuation procedures. Hamas, in turn, suspended hostage negotiations, demanding a cessation of attacks and the release of Palestinian prisoners. The IDF's alleged discoveries of concealed weapons and militant equipment throughout southern Gaza provided further justification for the continuation of their military campaign. 2. Intensification of fighting and humanitarian crisis. As the ceasefire collapsed, the conflict in Gaza entered a new and more intense phase. The IDF shifted its military focus to southern Gaza, particularly the densely populated city of Khan Yunis, which served as a power base for Hamas leadership. The Israeli military reoriented its strategy from airstrikes to ground operations, issuing evacuation warnings to Palestinians in Khan Yunis before launching full-scale military operations. The situation in Gaza became increasingly desperate, with 400,000 displaced Gazans moving south, only to find themselves trapped in a region racked by intense urban combat. The fighting in Khan Yunis was especially brutal, with the IDF uncovering what they claimed to be large caches of weapons and militant equipment adjacent to civilian sites like the Al-Amal Health Clinic and Beit Lahia School. The discovery of these weapons further fueled the Israeli military campaign, despite the growing risk of civilian casualties. 3. International response and diplomatic efforts. The intensification of the conflict in Gaza drew sharp reactions from the international community, with the United Nations and various human rights organizations raising concerns about the increasing civilian casualties and the potential for war crimes. The US continued to support Israel's stance against Hamas, but growing disagreements emerged between the US and Israel regarding the escalation of military actions. As the conflict wore on, Western nations, led by the US, urged the establishment of humanitarian corridors to assist the 2.3 million people in Gaza, highlighting the critical need to minimize civilian harm. Despite these efforts, the situation on the ground remained dire, with accusations of genocide against Israel gaining traction in some international circles. The United Nations Security Council attempted to address the Palestinian crisis head-on, but the US vetoed resolution drafts, stalling diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. Meanwhile, a Hamas delegation was dispatched to Cairo on December 24 to discuss a potential ceasefire plan with Egyptian mediators. As the world watched with bated breath, the hope for a peaceful resolution to the conflict seemed increasingly distant, with the